In the previous videos, I showed how to network Windows and Mac OS. And one thing I didn't show was how to network Linux. And one of the reasons for that is Linux is a very diverse ecosystem. With Windows and Mac, it's very similar. When you get a Windows distribution or a Mac distribution, it's almost always going to be the same. There may be some small differences in between different versions of Windows, for example, but the process for doing things like networking are going to be the same. When it comes to Linux, though, Linux has many different distributions. And not only does it have many different distributions, but it has many different platforms. So a CentOS version of Linux will be different from a Debian version of Linux. And the steps to network them together may be different. So the steps that I show in this video may not apply to other versions of Linux, depending on if they have a different user interface or if they use a different core system for networking, which is all very possible. So for this, what I thought I would do is show how to set up networking on one of the more common versions of Linux for business and live environments, and that is Red Hat, specifically Red Hat Linux. You can also get CentOS Linux, which is basically a free version of Red Hat. It's very, very similar in how they operate. So the steps that I show in here would work for a Red Hat system as well. So with Red Hat and all Linux distributions, there may or may not be a graphical user interface like this. This one I installed the default user interface, which is called GNOME 3. So it lets you use it obviously in a more graphical setting where you have icons and windows. In a server setting, more likely you'll have the command line like this, and you'll be running commands from the command line, and that's how you would operate with the server. But for right now, I'm going to set the IP address using the user interface. So for this particular user interface, you want to go up to the top right-hand corner, click on the little down icon arrow there. You want to go to the settings icon down here, click on that, and then the system settings window will come up. And then down here, you want to click on network. And you'll have the different networking interfaces available. In this case, it's just the one. Click on the settings icon there. And you can see here I have an IP address set through DHCP. If I go to IPv4, I can set it to manual. I can set the IP address, so it could be 172. And the gateway 172.16.10.1. And I could enter in the DNS server address as well. And it would work exactly the same as you would do this in Windows or Macintosh. But for this purpose, I'm going to stick with DHCP because that's already been set up. The other way to change the IP address is through the command line, which for administrating a Linux server is more common. And for this example, I'll just use the built-in terminal. So I'll go to Activities up here, and I'll click on the terminal icon there, and it will bring up the terminal where I can then run different commands. Now, changing an IP address from the command line is a more common thing to do, but also a more technical thing to do in Linux, especially with Red Hat, because there's several different ways you can do it, and the ways have actually changed since the last time I've used it, so I'm not even that familiar with it anymore on the Red Hat system. But the standard ways of changing it are to go into, for example, the networking scripts. You can change the file here, which shows all the different configuration options for an interface. There's command line utilities. For example, NMCLI is a command line utility that lets you modify and set static IP addresses from the command line. There's also a sort of graphical interface for it as well, Network Manager TUI or Terminal User Interface, which lets you also edit the commands like the you can set it to manual and you can set the IP address and all that, and all that other information. Hit OK. Whoops. I can go back to here. I'll just reset the adapter real quick, go back, and quit. And then if I type in ifconfig, you can see here it's set the address to be static. But even as I showed you on how to do it for CentOS and Red Hat Linux, that's not necessarily going to help you if you're in a Debian environment, for example. My personal laptop here that I'm using to make these videos runs Ubuntu Mate, which is a Debian version of Linux. So not only does it look different from the user interface, because it has a different user interface than the CentOS Linux had. Instead of using GNOME 3, it's something called Mate, which is, I find, a pretty simple user interface. But as you can see, the icons and menus and stuff are in different locations. So on my machine, for example, I would go down here to System, Control Center, and then I have network, Internet and Network, and from there I can set my network connections and stuff like that, very similar to how it would be done in Windows or Mac. But also, if I was to do it from the command line, the actual place where you would set this stuff is in a different location than it would be in CentOS, and it would be handled differently. So again, it really comes down to what version of Linux you're running and what user interface you're working with. Even just doing a Google search for Linux user interfaces, you can see probably a little bit how just crazy different Linux can look. It can look a lot like Windows. You can set it up so it looks almost identical to a Mac, for example. Like this picture right here, that looks almost exactly like a Mac, but it's not, it's Linux. So there's a lot of give and take with how you can use Linux, and even though it is still the most popular environment for servers, you still have to know how the underlying systems work in Linux to be able to use it properly. So hopefully that helps a little bit to help you understand how Linux networking works and sort of the issues with it that come up. The good news is that most of the time Linux servers are very tightly controlled by other departments. Usually there's people whose job is to operate Linux servers. So the chances that you will need to operate a Linux server for any particular reason is fairly low, but it could still happen. So not a bad idea to at least learn the basics of Linux and how to get it working, and just in that remote chance that you might need to do that. Thankfully, most of the networking stuff is exactly the same. It's just how you get the networking stuff into the computer that's different.